I want to talk about coding guidelines, best practices, and some of the rules I'm going to talk about might seem very picky, and it really depends on who you work with. So obviously I'm influenced by the company I'm working with and the way my colleagues and my group is working. But there's also guidelines that are more general used. For example, you can have a look at the Swift API design guidelines. And I wanted to, because I don't want to just go through some of these rules, I want to go for an example that I change where I want to use some of these rules. So you see the difference and what's the point behind this. So some of the main ideas behind these guidelines are here. For example, it says the first one is clarity at the point of use. And clarity is more important than brevity. Sometimes you tend to write very short code with a super nice algorithm. You feel really fancy because you put it in such a short and compact way. But it might not be the best thing for somebody else who needs to understand this because it might be short and very complex. So if you have the choice, it's better to go for clarity. You can also look at this from the point of view from clean code. So it needs to be easy to read, easy to understand, and easy to modify. This sounds very generic. One of the benefits is that if it's easy to read and understand, you're less likely to introduce new errors, bugs, because in your mind it's easier to grab the complexity of the whole code and change things. Okay, so now we are going to start looking at the example, and you can just try by yourself and think of what you would actually change. You can also recommend me something else. The way you should see this, whatever you find useful, you can take for yourself. You can just, the things that don't make sense, just leave it out. We don't need to argue about everything, although sometimes arguments can be very intense, especially if you have to agree, and working with a group, some of these things can take a little bit more time to settle. I decided to go for a playground page. I just need to run this to see it. Okay, usually I would have this in multiple files. This is also something we can talk about as best practices. But in this case, just for quicker overview, I have everything in one file. So this is one data type, one struct, which is called Netflix subscription. It has one property, expired, which is bool. Then I have a second struct, which is a Spotify subscription with a property expired date. Then I have here one instance of this subscription, which I use in the subscription view with the Spotify subscription. Right now I'm only showing here a text, so I'm not actually using the data right now. Now, as a real world example, I'm trying to make this more real world, because this is the main point. You want to make it readable for somebody who is just who sees your code, or if you see it later, you don't remember what you did. But in this case, this is the starting point, the existing application. And the designers should change this to also show a, depending on if the subscription is active or expired. If it's active, you have to show a button is active. Maybe you want to show an overlay or something. And if it's expired, we have to show a text saying has expired. Okay, I'm going to do these changes in the next one. I'm going to create a lot of pages, so you can have a look at each of them later. This is basically the same thing. And now I would start here below in the VStack, making this very easy to check if it's expired or if it's still active. So I would have a look at my subscription and go through the properties, and I see here it's expired, it's a date. From the name I would not be able to guess that this is a date type. I actually don't really know. It kind of feels more like a boolean. Okay, since this is a date, I need to know if the expiration date, this is more the expiration date, is smaller than now. So this would be date.now. Then I said I wanted to just show a button, is active, and else I'm just showing here a text, has expired. When I just went through this in my how to set this up, I realized I had to think quite a little bit about this, how to get the information, and thinking I always had to remember that this is a date type, and there's friction of thought, or like to make it easier on myself, especially in the future. I don't want to go through this thinking about this again. So I want to make it more clear in the future, just thinking of how could I have prevented myself from this trouble. And this is when clear names come into play. That is, it needs to be descriptive and there should not be any room for ambiguity. For example, right now I worked on this view showing these buttons, but in case I have another part of my app I work afterwards, where I use the other type, the Netflix subscription, then I would be extremely confused because then I check expired and it's a boolean and I remembered I was expecting a date. So named and property should be descriptive, but you also should have some consistency. If you fix yourself on one convention, you should stick with this. Otherwise, you have to rethink every time you touch different parts of your app or different types of data, and it's just like not consistent. And you make yourself confused, and I don't like to be confused. In order to prevent this, I should rename this to be more descriptive, saying what this is. So this one, because when I went through, I was like, oh yeah, this is more like an expiration date, so I'm renaming this. Why is this not working? Okay, if you see a renaming, then use the renaming. Okay, it seems like Xcode just doesn't like me right now. So this is a boolean, so I would call this something like is expired, because this is booleans usually start with is or has. Then I need to rename this here. And also in the initializer, you have to... Then I go for my Spotify subscription, which is the one that I had problems right now. And this one is a date, so it's an expiration date or expire date, or yeah. So I need to change this everywhere. I use this. Okay, the renaming feature would have been nice. Okay, the ultimate test for if my naming conventions, if my names now make sense, is reading my own code again, which is if my subscription expiration date is smaller than date.now. No, this is the other way around. I think I have to rewrite this. I always like to have okay, if my current date is smaller than the expiration date, that means if the expiration date is in the future, is upcoming, then I show it's active and otherwise it's false. So it does read a lot better, but still I'm like, what does this actually mean? And when I thought about it, it's like, is expired, so I still want to have something that tells me easier what this means. I don't want to think about what logical whatever this is. So the changing the name did help, but I can improve the readability further by creating a separate function that helps me understand what I'm actually doing here, because I want to have something that says is active or has expired. So I'm just creating another page. You can also do this in the same one. So now I want to create a separate function for this, or that says it, and I can create a function here. So has expired, and I'm just going to put this logic in there. Oh, this is returning a bool. It's equal to. This is another convention you have to decide on. Some people just use the is true. Some people say is equal to true to make it really clear. Now this is the other way around. So I'm just going to need to change my button and my text. Okay, let's read this again to see if we improved further. So we have the text, Spotify subscription, then if has expired is true, then we say has expired, and otherwise we have a button saying is active. So by creating this function, it's already more descriptive. I don't have to think here. I don't have to go through this logical bit. It just says it has expired. This already helps me because sometimes, right now this is a small bit of logic, but maybe I have a lot of conditions. Or if you are in your SwiftUI view, sometimes they get really large and you have large if statements, and sometimes you don't even see where the if ends. So if you then add additionally the complexity of having to think of what does this condition actually mean, then this can help you a little bit going faster through your code and knowing what's going on. But now I'm like, okay, the next thing is I'm seeing here this expired function, and I'm like, this only depends on this subscription property, and it is actually something that the subscription is one of the attributes of the subscription, if it has expired or not. It's like a attribute or a property. And maybe not just in this one view, I need to use this checking here, or this find out if it has expired or not. Maybe I want to do that in different views, and then I would need to copy this function. So it would be actually handy to have this at other positions in my code base too. So the question is, should I store it here, or would it make more sense to belong somewhere else where I can reuse it easier for other views? And for this, you're going to use a little bit of objective-oriented programming. So this is a property, and it's only this Boolean value only depends on the subscription, so it should go together in the subscription. That's why I say objective-oriented programming, because you can add more convenience to your structural classes. It's a bit the same for structs. You can add functions, computed properties, whatever you like. I'm going to create another page where we use object-oriented programming. Okay, starting off from the last point, I said this should be part of my Spotify subscription. And now, instead of here using the subscription, it's just expiration date. So now in my view, I am not accessing the function from this view. It is in the subscription. So the subscription. So now it reads, if the subscription has expired, if it is true, then show this expiration text, and otherwise it's active button. This already reads like a normal sentence, and it's very much Swift, or from this taking advantage of this nice putting logic bits together. Now I have this function, but I already said it's more like a property. So sometimes if you know it's more like a property, you can also make it look from the outside more like a property. You can just say it's a computed property, actually. If it's like a property, but you have to compute it, it's a computed property. Var, so I'm going to change this into a var, bool. So, which means then here in my view, I don't need to use the function call, it's just like a normal property. It is a small difference, but sometimes if it feels like a property, it can be like a property, but obviously you can change your mind. Just as a small side note, I moved the computed property above the init. I probably have to make a separate thing about this, but it's good to structure your code in a certain order, to be consistent in the order. You would first, for example, write all your properties, then your computed properties, your init, and then your convenience function. Because first it was a function, it was after the init, and now it's a computed property, so for me it belongs to properties. That's why it's above it. This can be different for different people, but it's good to have some consistency in there. Because then you're just, it's easier to, this is a very short file. But if it's a long one and you have to actually scroll, then it's good that you don't have to scroll. If there are properties somewhere between the functions, you might forget that you actually created it, and you create another one, and you have some code duplication, some duplicated properties, for example. So it's good to be a little consistent in this one. Okay, this was some talk about object-oriented programming and why it can make your code a lot easier to read, a lot cleaner. Why object-oriented programming actually is by itself clean if you use it. The next task is, we have here this has expired, but in one case I have has expired. Okay, this is already not good that I have different ones, but we can also name this as int active. And this negative and positive ways of formulating your properties does in some cases make it easier for certain things. In order to demonstrate this, for example, in some part of your application, you would now need to place a play button. This is Spotify, so maybe you want to play music, but only if the subscription is active. So you need to disable a button when it's not active. So I'm just going to put this button below, just for easier thing. Probably wouldn't make sense to have it in the same view. So this is a new page. Okay, starting by creating a button, play. Right now I'm not doing anything. And in order to disable this or enable this, so per default it's enabled, but it has also a disabled property. So if our subscription has expired, then we want to disable this. Did I do something wrong? Okay, I did again something with my logic. This is the point where I have to start off, maybe because I first had it as active and now I have it like this. But at this point I probably should just fix myself onto one way of formulating this. And so in this case it works nicely because my disabled is the negative form and my has expired is the negative form. But maybe your designer changes his mind and they're going to be, actually I just want to, maybe you hide the whole thing. So I would go has expired, then I'm not showing this whole thing. So, and then I have to go for negative. So if it has not expired, so this kind of negative is already not good. I probably should go for false. Oh no, that's actually not making it better. So this kind of negatives of saying the negative of the negative, it's making a headache. It's logically quite difficult. And I'm German, so I'm used to complicated wording and grammar. But still, it's a little bit of a headache to go for negatives. So maybe we go instead of, since we just realized this negatives, maybe I go with is active instead. It's also good because then I can rename this one. So I'm going to make this one is, my renaming doesn't work, active. And now I have to really do this properly. Just once my logic works. At least now I have this, I never have to think about this again. And then here, this is also is active. Because I want to be consistent in all of my code. I shouldn't have an is active and expired, and this to subscription should be consistent. So I have to make this true. It's per default active. Okay, now I have this is active property. So if is active, then I'm showing this button. Otherwise it has expired. And then if my subscription is active, this is true, then I show this button. And as the other example, after this button is disabled, if the subscription is active, actually it should be if it's not active. The problem with this not is it's in front of the subscription. So it's like if the button is disabled, if it's not, the subscription is active. I don't like to read this, and I would have preferred to have I oftentimes find myself in a situation that I get confused with this disabled view modifier. And it happened so often that I start to think maybe it is because I should get used, at this point I should get used to it, but I'm not. Maybe it's time to change this in a way that I can handle it better, which means not a negative, a disabled. Maybe I want to have a enabled button, and then I can just say subscription is active. That would be much nicer. But obviously this is not per default shipped with SwiftUI, so I have to write it myself. No problem. I can do this if I get it what I want. So this is a extension to the view, and these view modifiers are functions. So this is enabled. It takes in a bool, and I'm just writing it the same way. Enabled bool. It returns some view. I'm adding it to view because then I can add it everywhere, not just to buttons. So I'm returning the view itself, but I need to place this in the environment because I need to invert this for the. I need to actually override this is enabled. With enabled, I have to put this here at the position of the environment property if it's enabled, because this is also, this is access from the environment. Here you see it's the property that you can use somewhere inside. I just want to make sure I'm using the standard way SwiftUI handles this, so I don't introduce some side effects. Okay, this I don't need. And then actually I don't need this part anymore. So now I switched from this negative that always makes me think of negatives to enabled, which is a positive. So I can just say, okay, it's enabled if my subscription is active. Then I can actually press the play button. If you have problems with the logic and you always have to, there's always some friction and you always have to rethink this, you always have to clear something in your mind, it's maybe time to change something, especially with negatives. So positive properties are always better, and never write something like is not active or is inactive. This is pretty damn difficult. Okay, with this I want to finish. I went through a couple of things that can make your code a lot more readable, a lot more clean. This includes how to name properties properly, extracting logic into its own functions or properties, to take advantage of object-oriented programming and structure your code more logical, where you can find parts of your logic again, so you can reuse it and have a consistent way of doing things. Also, consistency in the naming conventions is important, to not get confused with different parts, and to not name things with a negative, to not name Boolean values with a negative. It can make your life harder than it has to be, and that's the main thing. You have enough things to take care of. The complexity of the application is getting more and more demanding. So trying to make things as simple for yourself as possible is a good idea. There will be more videos about clean code where I give more examples. Probably going to repeat some of this stuff just because I like to go through one example. I am doing this because it can help you with your job interviews, because some of the stuff your future colleagues will look for because they have to read your code, and if they don't understand it, they get really annoyed and they won't want to work with you. This is in some cases even more important than knowing all the algorithms and all the features of SwiftUI. You can easier improve by learning more about SwiftUI features or UI kit features, but relearning how to write code and more clean is probably more work also for your group to help you change. You get a lot of comments on your pull requests if your code is not the way they want it. Some of the stuff is obviously depending on people, especially the naming conventions. This is one of the most biggest discussions that I have on my pull request of, can you rename this? This doesn't make sense. So if you struggle with this, this is very normal. This is something that will pop up over time. This was a short video about my life is messy, but my code base is clean. Until next time, happy coding!